Hey everybody, Dr. Rob Silverman here, Proven Health Alternatives. I have my esteemed colleague. This young lady is without question a functional medicine superstar, Dr. Deanna Minich. How are
Hi there.
you?
Hi, Rob. Good to be here with you.
We were just having a great time talking, and we're just ready to jump in. We want to talk about melatonin
Hmm.
and melatonin, how it's the new vitamin D, and all the things that melatonin can do. But specifically, I want to talk about melatonin as a circadian nutrient. Never heard
Yeah.
that term before.
Well, I introduced that term into the literature because after writing that review paper, I just realized that melatonin is more than a hormone. So many people talk about melatonin as a hormone, but as we looked at vitamin D and melatonin side by side, I soon came to realize that melatonin looks a lot like vitamin D. It's almost like a nutrient. And the reason I call it a circadian nutrient is because the circadian rhythm is connected to the 24-hour cycle. Melatonin is connected to that 24-hour cycle, but then also we lose melatonin as we get older. So I do think if a nutrient is fulfilling some kind of need in the body physiologically, I think that melatonin does fill the gap for that. So I see it as a nutrient. It's a hormone. It is an anti-inflammatory. It's an immune modulator. It's a mitochondrial regulator. And so it has a lot of different, I would say that melatonin wears a lot of hats.
So, in a nutshell, you're saying that melatonin, without question, is a superstar because it has a broad swath of properties that are health promoting. Now, you've got some, like you said, some articles, one of which I'm going to look at right now, which was a review of emerging science, clinical uses. And to piggyback on what you said earlier, the age related decrease in melatonin in
Yeah.
humans. You did a great job where you showed that when we're born, we have minimal melatonin. When we're young, we're vibrant, it's up. And then as puberty goes all the way down, then you hit my age where you're almost an older an adult. Thanks, appreciate that. And you produce a negligible amount of melatonin. Why is that?
Yeah, well, I think it's like most other hormones. If you look at estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, you start to see that subtle decline with age. And then eventually you enter into what I would call the pause period. So you've got menopause, perimenopause, postmenopause, andropause, and I would even say that we have melatonopause. So melatonin in the way of being produced by the pineal gland, and I think we have to differentiate, Rob, because melatonin is not just produced by the pineal gland, but the pineal gland derived melatonin would be what we see reduced throughout age. So by the time we're in our mid 50s, we're bottomed out. By the time we're in our 60s, 70s, we have negligible pineal gland derived melatonin. Now, the other side of melatonin is to look at where else it is produced. It's produced in the gut, and that's more in an autocrine or a paracrine way, so not the true endocrine fashion like the pineal gland. The mitochondria can produce melatonin, but we are starting to miss out on that pineal gland derived melatonin with age. So again, that is melatonopause. That's another new term that is not in the literature. That term was introduced by Dr. Dickon Weatherby. I was on a podcast with him and we were talking about exactly what we're talking about right now, like this roller coaster decline in hormones. And he said, that sounds like melatonopause. So I thought
Wow.
that that was a very interesting way to think about it. And he's right.
Now, melatonin, when most people hear about it or the questions they ask me, it's real simple. Is it good for sleep? Do you have to titrate it? Now,
Mm,
again, I know you're going to give a litany of all the things that it can do, but can we answer the basic questions? Would you take
yeah.
it to aid in sleep? What does it do for sleep?
So what it does for sleep is it sets the circadian rhythm as it relates to sleep. So melatonin is produced in the darkness. So when it starts to get dim outside, we start to produce more and more melatonin from the pineal gland. And eventually we reach a core body temperature that facilitates us going to sleep. So one of the functions of melatonin is to reduce core body temperature. So that's why I start to think about perimenopausal women with hot flashes, night sweats. There's a dysregulation of their thermoregulatory center. So potentially they could have the melatonin implicated with that low estrogen, low progesterone. But yes, melatonin is helpful for sleep, and it also can create kind of a sleepy effect in people. So it does have what's called a hypnotic or a soporific effect, meaning that it can initiate sleep. So best practices, if you're using melatonin for sleep, is to take a supplement, a melatonin supplement, 40 to 60 minutes before the intended bedtime. So if you take it too early, you run the risk of potentially having more of a sleepy effect. Now, you asked about titrating dose. If you look, so when you looked at the paper and you saw the curve of what people produce, the pineal gland produces on average 0.3 milligrams in middle age. So if you look at that curve, you can kind of draw a line and you can see, oh, it's about 0.3. So when you say titrating a dose, I think that that's a very important point because some people take too much. And I think that the issue with melatonin is not taking a supplement, but taking too much of it and taking it at the wrong time. So starting at 0.3, and then if that isn't effective for somebody, maybe going up to 0.6, 0.9, but really trying to stay within that 0.3 to close to that 1 milligram threshold. I think that that's a really good starting place. But if somebody is jet lagged, and let's just say they travel from New York City to Rome, that's a different situation. Now we need to use a higher dose of melatonin to jumpstart our circadian rhythm in that setting.
So essentially, you're saying if I'm going east, New York City to Rome, it's more detrimental to my sleep cycle, my circadian rhythm. So I need more melatonin as if I'm going back in time. So if we're going forward in time, we need more melatonin, they go back in time. Now, a lot of people talk about dosage, and I don't want to get lost in the weeds in dosage of 3 to 5 milligrams.
That would be more for jet lag. And
That
the
would be
reason why
general.
is because that's going to provoke that circadian reset in a stronger way in those particular settings. Whereas the average person in their everyday life, just wanting to fill the gap on their endogenous melatonin, that's more consistent with 0.3 milligrams, right? That's more about the repletion. And then to build upon that, depending on what the need state would be. And I think we also need to think much broader about sleep, like vitamin D can be implicated in sleep through its connection with melatonin. Rob, you also asked about, titrating the dose. You asked about sleep. One of the things that some people have been very intrigued about with melatonin at night is that it is anti-inflammatory. So oftentimes we think that people can't sleep because they have neuroinflammation. The other thing that melatonin has been shown to do is to promote the exit of toxic metabolites from the brain into the glymphatic fluid. And the glymphatic fluid is the fluid around the brain that is the repository of a lot of these metabolites that can exit when we sleep. That cannot happen when we're awake. So melatonin seems to be facilitating that process. So why would melatonin be helpful for sleep? Well, it's actually engaging in brain detoxification. It's helping us with neuroinflammation, and it's helping to set the circadian tone. So I think from those three perspectives, we see a compelling reason to connect melatonin with sleep.
That was great because we know that the brain shrinks to about 40% of its size at night in good quality sleep. It's like a sponge squeezing out all the
Yep.
metabolic waste like you talked about. Now, the circadian rhythm, that's a critical element of that is mixing that because of intermittent fasting, which is everybody's number one lifestyle hack. So if you're saying it resets the circadian rhythm and the data does back that up, you now walked into the intermittent fasting conversation and using this as a staple in intermittent fasting, which I love. Therefore, melatonin, and data does back this up also, and you can take the baton from here, helps with autophagy.
Yes, what's really intriguing about melatonin, if we can remember the M of melatonin tracks to the M in mitochondria. These two things go hand in hand. When you look at the cell, the organelle with the highest concentration of melatonin is the mitochondria. The mitochondria can make its own melatonin. Why do we need melatonin in the mitochondria? Well, where does the harnessing of energy happen? Where do all of those reactive oxygen species get generated? Where are all those oxidative bursts? And where does the cell clean house or get rid of that debris? The mitochondria is key. So the melatonin that the mitochondria takes up and can make is key for helping to quell rancidity of the cell and to actually help with cleanup. And Rob, the other thing I didn't mention, but this is, I think, important is, many people wake up at about 2 in the morning. I hear that from people over and over again. Like there's even a friend of mine who has a 2 in the morning family club of like, she has some relatives, they all wake up at 2 in the morning. It's such a common time. Well, what's really interesting, there was one study in which they show that melatonin peaks at 2 a.m. Between that 2 to 4 a.m. window, melatonin peaks, and melatonin can lead to the production of glutathione and superoxide dismutase and catalase and glutathione peroxidase. So you have this cascade of antioxidant defense and repair, all which would be important for autophagy, right? Cellular cleanup. So, and you mentioned intermittent fasting. Fasting and eating, when we eat, when we're active, these are zeitgebers, time givers. They punctuate our day. They also fuel our circadian rhythm. They tell us when we are awake to do certain things. And then the reason why I think intermittent fasting, or the way that I think of it, time restricted feeding, where we stop eating after 5 or 6, now we give our bodies the chance to clear and move into melatonin mode and to prepare for sleep.
I really love how you tied the melatonin to the mitochondria, because the number one complaint in a physician's office now is fatigue. Long
Yes.
COVID's based on mitochondrial
Yeah.
issues. So if I put together a long COVID protocol, melatonin would be at the top of the list. It also was great, and I know you're going to run with this, during the time of COVID, because a high dose kind of quelled that cytokine storm. If melatonin is increasing glutathione, the master antioxidant, the high levels of glutathione are critical to protect the tight junction in the gut, which speaks to the immune system. So to unpack that, let's jump into melatonin and the immune system and inflammation, etc.
That's beautiful. You just connected a lot of dots there. I can see how your mind is weaving it all together. Yeah, and in fact, I think that melatonin made its foray into our, I would say, into a lot of nutrition talk right now because of the pandemic. Because I noticed that the papers were talking about vitamin D, vitamin C, zinc, and all of a sudden we started hearing about melatonin. And exactly what you said, that there is literature to suggest that melatonin can help to quell the cytokine storm, that it can help to block NF-kappa B. And in its protective anti-inflammatory aspects, it helps to bolster the immune system. In fact, I mean, I haven't gone into it, but there is some literature on the immune cell differentiation and all of the different cell types being responsive, differentially responsive to melatonin. So indeed, now what we're seeing is that melatonin supplementation is being woven into long haul type of protocols for this immune benefit. And Rob, when I stack up the literature and I look at, okay, what is melatonin historically? What has it been used for? There's a preponderance of data on immune. And I think that gets overlooked. We just shortcut and we just think sleep. But quite honestly, there's a brain type of connection to melatonin. There's an immune strong connection to melatonin. Now we're starting to see more with gastrointestinal indications. You had already mentioned about glutathione in the gut. So yeah, I think we need to see this as a web, that it's the psychoneuroendocrine immune system. And melatonin to me seems to be one of those molecules that is a connector.
Wow, heavy duty stuff. I love it. So melatonin in the gut supports the immune system by including an interaction with immune cells. It promotes a healthy inflammatory response, like you said, decreases NF-kappa B. NF-kappa B is that signal transducer for all those interleukins and cytokines, etc. And it supports a heavy antioxidant status.
Correct.
So I've
Well,
got something.
let's talk about that antioxidant status just for a second before we move on, because I think what people need to also realize is that anti-inflammatory activity is connected to antioxidant status. So we need to bolster that with a number of different antioxidants, right? Like vitamin C, vitamin E. Now, each antioxidant has its own properties. Vitamin C is very unique. It's water soluble, right? So it's in certain tissues. It's really high in the brain. It's really high in the adrenal glands. Vitamin E is a little bit different. It's fat soluble. What makes melatonin unique as an antioxidant, thereby contributing to its anti-inflammatory effects, is that it likes fat and it likes water. So it's called amphiphilic. It can flex. It could go into the blood and it can be in the brain, which makes it this very diverse molecule that can play in a lot of different body tissues. So I want everybody to remember this. One molecule of melatonin can quench 10 free radicals. So even the metabolites of melatonin are antioxidant, whereas vitamin C on average can quench like 1 to 2 free radicals, right? So I'm not dismissing vitamin C as being important. Vitamin C is important. Vitamin E is important. It's just that with melatonin specifically, it's very unique in its chemical configuration. It enables it to actually be water soluble and fat soluble so it can get more places and have activity.
That's great on the melatonin because you talked about the big antioxidant, vitamin C. It's also able to quench more free radicals than vitamin E.
Yeah,
And its ability to produce glutathione, the master antioxidant, that number is adding zeros to it. Some people say 1,000,
correct.
10,000. Some people have even said in the millions. And the only other thing that I know that is an antioxidant that gets into the water and the fat part of the cells is alpha lipoic acid.
That's true.
Right. So melatonin is producing a myriad of properties. And that's what we talked about at the beginning with the swath. Now, interesting, again, getting back to that circadian rhythm, an intermittent faster. I love it. I agree with you. Time restricted feeding, time restricted eating. But when you've got that internal circadian clock working, your microbes in your gut work better. So if anybody comes in that has a gut issue, increased intestinal permeability, melatonin is a great choice. It's also shown to decrease LPS. Now, I know, something about omega-3 fatty acids. I think you wrote a paper on that once. I'm trying to be
My
facetious.
PhD dissertation was on essential fatty acids, actually.
Right. So that melatonin mixed with omega-3s in the gut, here's your baton again. Go for it.
Good combination because of the anti-inflammatory effect, right? Omega-3s are important for every cell membrane. So not just in the gut, but actually throughout the entire body and even within the brain where it's very fatty, it's very lipid rich. So I think you're raising a good point here because it's not just about melatonin. We need to look at the composite. We need to look at alpha lipoic acid. So many people ask me, how do I know if I need melatonin? And I think that they can look at a basic assessment, a lot of different symptoms, just like how does somebody know that they need omega-3 fatty acids? Typically, you do a lab test and you see what your omega-3 index is. What percent are you, right? That's a tried and true test. Now with melatonin, it's not so clear cut. Not so clear cut. So I think we need to rely on things like age. I do think that most people are what I would call darkness deficient, meaning that they work late into those evening hours. They're on the computer, they're on the screen. Small children are on their iPhones, scrolling late at night. All of this is reducing our body's ability to produce melatonin through the intrinsically photoreceptive, the retinal ganglion cells, right? So we have specific cells within the eye that are going to be more sensitive to blue light. And if we have blue light exposure, then we will be reducing our ability to produce melatonin. So for people that get all of that exposure, they're highly inflamed, they're in their 50s and beyond, they're on computers, they're not conscientious about their eye exposure to light, and they're not consistent with healthy circadian rhythm. These folks definitely need to be looking at melatonin.
Part of your article that I'm looking at right now is vitamin D and melatonin as light and dark sensors with shared functions. I think
Correct.
people want to know, okay, so I can take these two together,
Yes.
and what's the epiphany there?
Yeah, so with vitamin D, let's just compare them, melatonin and vitamin D. So first of all, vitamin D is only fat soluble, it's not water soluble. They're both found in the skin. They're both antioxidants, they're both immunomodulators. And there was a study, and I don't have it in front of me, Rob, but essentially there was a study in which they showed that, and this was, I believe, it just in women, and it was looking at how vitamin D deficiency was connected to melatonin levels. So when you correct for vitamin D deficiency, you help to restore melatonin levels. This is why I see them as circadian nutrients. It's like the brother and the sister, the yin and the yang. Vitamin D is connected to the sun exposure through the skin, and melatonin is connected to the darkness. And I think that so many people have learned more about vitamin D, but now they need to learn about the other side, which is the darkness aspect. So now more people are realizing, oh my gosh, I shouldn't be avoiding sun exposure. I need to just be careful for my skin type, but not be avoiding it. Well, I think we need to start to think the same about darkness. Let's not avoid darkness. Let's have a little bit more darkness at night, dim the lights. I don't know about you, but I measure light in my rooms. I use an app on my phone. And through that light, all you do is you scan. In this app that I use, there are a bunch of them, but the one I have is called Light Meter. It's free. So you download it and you go into the room that you're sleeping and you just open up the app and then you scan and it'll give you a number. And what you're aiming for late at night is really in your bedroom or wherever you're sleeping, you want it to be less than 1 lux.
Hmm.
1 lux is a measure or a unit of light, and 1 lux is equivalent to a candle flame 3 feet away, just to give you a sense of how much that is. So in the average day, when we go out in the sunlight, that's like 15,000 to 40,000 lux. But at nighttime, we need to downscale that. So what is happening is, like right now, both you and I are indoors. It's sunny outside, but now our light exposure is like 100 times less than it should be. And then at night, many people have many times the amount of light that is not in the environment. So we have this dysregulation. We are not in sync with the sun nor the darkness, and that is a problem for these nutrients.
Now, we were talking about vitamin D and melatonin. You've really got to take D3 with K2. Otherwise, any kind of vitamin D3 loads is detrimental. Do you have to take melatonin with anything? You can take it straight up on the rocks, if you will.
You can take it straight up. In fact, it's probably better to take it straight up. And the reason why is because melatonin is metabolized by the liver and it's metabolized by cytochrome 1A2. So let's just say you have coffee too late. Caffeine is metabolized through cytochrome 1A2. Now you're going to change melatonin metabolism. Anything that impacts cytochrome 1A2 will impact melatonin. So keep melatonin just on its own. don't at least that's my preference. And in fact, I think sometimes people have paradoxical effects of melatonin supplements because they're taking kind of a mixture of different things that might actually counteract or may not be synergistic and helpful. You know, I think you know this clinically. Many times you see that people take B vitamins before they go to bed because it's in a sleep formula, but some of those B vitamins can be excitatory. It can, like vitamin B6 can kind of get you more wired in certain people. And then they put B6 sometimes in a melatonin formula. Now you have this kind of dynamic tension. So I think it's better in general just to have melatonin just straight up 40 to 60 minutes before bedtime is the usual protocol. And then that has a half-life over the sleeping window for the majority of it.
Well, I want to take some melatonin. So what kind of melatonin do I take? Because I know we had a little conversation about that before. It's not like I can go in the dairy section, which I know I shouldn't talk about with the two of us, where the vegan cheese is, and go get some melatonin. So what form of melatonin should I take?
Yeah, well, and I think it's good for people, number one, to work with their healthcare practitioner. I think that first and foremost, to assess, just work with somebody who can move you through that process. Secondly, most of the melatonin that is on the market is synthetically created. So, Rob, back in 1958, when melatonin was extracted from the pineal gland of animals like cows and pigs, what they started to do was to concentrate that, but that was impractical. So what had to happen was then it became chemically synthesized. And so then it was cheap. It was inexpensive to actually create this melatonin through petrochemicals. But by way of that manufacture, there can be all kinds of contaminants that can be created. In fact, there's a paper from 2018 where the authors talk about up to 13 different contaminants. So my preference, and first of all, in full disclosure, I am Chief Science Officer at Symphony Natural Health, and they make a plant melatonin. So of course, I take herbatonin, which is theirs. It is not extracted. It comes from rice, chlorella, and alfalfa. And in fact, if you look at it in the capsule, it's green. So it's just the plant material with bioidentical to our melatonin, the same melatonin that's in plants, which by the way, it doesn't differ. And it's also been shown in a study head to head with synthetic melatonin to outperform in many different functions. So it's close to 700, it's 646% more anti-inflammatory than synthetic melatonin. It's up to 470% greater in its free radical scavenging. So there was a study that came out in Molecules 2021 where basically the researchers looked side by side herbatonin and synthetic melatonin, and they found that in all of these cell assays, it was doing so much better. And quite honestly, I think it's because herbatonin has phytonutrients. It's got different, it's got essential fatty acids. It's got different amino acids, but all in small proportions, but most likely just enough to potentiate its effect.
So you like the plant form and you like all those phytonutrients. I know we had a conversation. You are, without question, the doctor from eating from the rainbow.
Yes, I am. So melatonin, in my mind, connects to green for sure,
Okay.
because of its, although, melatonin is in a lot of different foods. In fact, one of the questions that comes up to me, because I am a nutrition scientist, is, hey, Deanna, can I just eat a bunch of tart cherries and get enough melatonin?
Hmm.
So in that article, and it would be nice to actually have that happen, right? Because we are getting melatonin in foods. We're getting it mostly in fruits, nuts, and seeds, where melatonin tends to be high. Melatonin tends to be high in plants and the reproductive portions of plants. It's actually a growth factor for things like glucosinolates and other types of phytochemicals in plants. So, but when you actually run the numbers, it would take thousands of cherries in order to get 0.3 milligrams of melatonin. And many times what we know is that you can't standardize melatonin in a plant crop. It's going to vary depending on season, location, the types of environmental exposures. So it's really difficult to try to figure out how much you would need from food. And we just got through talking about how you shouldn't eat before bedtime. So now, do I think cherries are important? Absolutely. Tart cherries, Montmorency cherry juice and cherries have been shown to be antioxidant, just helpful overall because of the polyphenols that they contain. So I would never want to discourage somebody from eating cherries. It's just not thousands of cherries in order to get melatonin.
It's kind
I
of
think
like
that's impractical.
kind of like resveratrol. Everybody thinks they can get it from wine. You need about 43 glasses. So if you're able to consume that to get your resveratrol, you got bigger fish to fry in your life.
That's a
Speaking of
great comparison, actually.
there you go. I mean, I always used to do that. They used to say, yeah, I drink. And I'm like, well, how much do you drink? How social are you? And
Right.
it was like 41 to 43 glasses. But bringing up resveratrol makes me think of longevity, which is
Yeah.
the topic of today. Without question, Dr. Hyman, Dr. T, they've done a great job of really making an imprint on everybody discussing longevity. How about melatonin as a longevity aid or as a need in longevity for all of us to turn on all the health switches, if you will?
Often I look at people in the fields who are biohackers, and I just kind of peer into what they're taking. And there are a handful that you and I both follow that are taking melatonin. So right there, it just tells me that they're informed by people who know the science of melatonin and longevity. Now, is melatonin going to make you live long? I don't know the answer to that. I haven't seen enough prospective studies where they've looked at populations and tracked them along. But will melatonin address the mechanisms of aging? Yes. If we think of inflammaging, the low chronic inflammation that basically wears on our reserves and leads us to accelerated aging. So we already know that melatonin works as an anti-inflammatory. So yes, is melatonin important in the process helping with detoxification? And we know that toxins are connected to accelerated aging. Well, the answer to that is yes. What about antioxidant response? The answer to that is yes. What about the mitochondria? Dr. Terry Walls and I had a wonderful conversation about the mitochondria and melatonin. And so, yes, so I think melatonin hits on multiple cylinders that connect to the mechanisms of aging, right? And if we want to live better and have better quality of life, if we're working on those different mechanisms with melatonin, theoretically, we should start to see some of those improvements.
Outstanding. So for me, melatonin isn't just the lifespan, it's the health span. So you
Yes.
have made a beyond a compelling argument on the health span, but now we're getting into that idea of the lifespan. It's funny. I gave a talk recently at the Harvard Club, and these people were of great wealth. They weren't worried about dying because life is good. They
Yeah.
just wanted to live healthy. And it's interesting when we discuss melatonin, you said we could go here. There are a couple of very famous, erudites, Dr. Andrew Huberman and Dr. David Sinclair, who have a tremendous amount of information to offer, but they differ from you and I in that they're not real positive on melatonin. And I know you wanted to tackle that.
Well, I would just like to have a discussion with both of them about that, about, what is it that they're seeing that isn't compelling? Because melatonin is like an evolutionary molecule. It's been around, it's an ancient molecule. It's been around for millennia. So, it's nothing new. It's very safe. There is copious research to support its pleiotropic actions. So I would just be curious to know exactly. I think what they're getting at is how people are overdoing melatonin for sleep. And perhaps that is kind of the problem, because I do see that there's some criticism about that. And, I get media types of alerts on melatonin, and it's always about chewables and gummies and children overdosing and these kinds of things. And I would be very critical of those things as well. But if we're just focused on longevity, healthy aging, then I think we need to look more critically at the science. So perhaps that's something that they haven't done, or perhaps they have. I'm not sure. I don't know the extent of it. I am a fan of resveratrol, so I would concur with Dr. Sinclair that resveratrol is wonderful. It's such a molecule of healthy aging for sure. It's just that resveratrol is just different in chemical configuration, right? It's actually a phytoestrogen. When you look at it like through the phytochemical family tree, it is it has different types of responses. So in theory, I would think that resveratrol and melatonin could be very complementary in their proposed mechanisms at the cellular level.
I agree. I think that would be a great longevity formula. And when we'd spoken before, I said I wanted to give some of my background and give one or two studies to add to all that you did in the fact of the effects of melatonin in intervertebral disc cells actually
Yeah.
had a positive outcome on intervertebral disc aging and degeneration. Believe it or not, melatonin inhibits the disc cell apoptosis and degeneration in multiple ways, It promotes matrix anabolism in intervertebral disc cells. And we've already discussed it. It resists oxidative stress, regulates autophagy, inhibits inflammation. Guys who have a musculoskeletal injury, 8 out of 10 Americans at some point have lower back
Yeah.
injury. Most
Yeah.
people come in with bulging discs. Melatonin is the jam if you're going to use natural options, in addition to things that you talked about before, vitamin D3, omega-3 fatty acids, and the such. So melatonin is, without question, quite versatile. I think I'm going to ask you if you could call it the Swiss Army knife of
Aging.
nutrients. Yeah, okay.
Yes,
I
of
like
aging
it.
and nutrients. I love that, Rob. That's brilliant. The Swiss Army knife of nutrients.
See how
Well,
you
and
can
I
work that
really
in.
see I'm learning something from you because I did not know that about disc health, right? And you're the expert on that clearly. However, it makes sense to me because of the mechanisms that we know to be true for melatonin. So once you understand scientifically the mechanisms, you can start to apply it across the board to so many conditions. You and I were talking before we just jumped on about there was just a publication that came through my PubMed alerts talking about melatonin supplementation and potentially being helpful for food allergy.
Mm.
Well, that kind of makes sense, right? If the gut is producing melatonin, that's a little bit of a different form of melatonin, but if we might be able to quell inflammation at the level of the gut, or at least maybe block some of the impact, the immune reactivity of some of the foods coming in through melatonin, I don't know. I think that that is quite interesting. We also know, and you alluded to this previously, that melatonin can help to modify the gut microbiome. In fact, there was a study, I think it came out in May of this year, 2023, talking about how the maternal use of melatonin supplementally can potentially prime that of their offspring with respect to the microbiome. So you're giving the leg up on the new life's gut microbiome just by the mother having melatonin. So that to me says something. I thought that that was pretty compelling.
Food allergies. I'm curious now. Also, I'm going to search for food sensitivities because melatonin decreases the expression of LPS, and as you know,
Right.
lipopolysaccharide is extremely ruinous to anything that it directly binds to.
Yeah.
And 52% of people that have a disc injury have a bacterial translocation. So melatonin's on the preventative side in the gut,
Ooh.
protecting LPS from getting expressed, because that expression damages the disc and it fixes it at the back end. So now we've got that musculoskeletal conversation that we can have at a later date.
It's
So,
interesting. Well, I'm going to be talking about melatonin when you and I both go to Columbia. It's already in my presentation. There's it's one of those musculoskeletal type of interventions. So, but I never thought about it for disc health, though. I think that that's intriguing.
and I think that we should have this melatonin masterclass. I think everybody calls them master classes now, and
Yeah.
get everybody from different lenses and vantage points. And I think you'll see how they use it, just like they've done for vitamin D, 5, 10, and 15 years ago. So I really
Right.
agree with you. I want to echo what you say. Melatonin is the new vitamin D. Where can I get that article?
Well, that is in Nutrients. We published that in September 2022, and it's available online. I can give you the link. And also, I just pulled up, just FYI, you inspired me because you're looking up articles. That article on melatonin and food allergy, it was published in the Journal of Pineal Research, July 21st, 2023. And these authors were talking about the impact of how food allergy affects more than 500 million people in the world. Its prevalence is increasing. And so they're looking at the interplay of immune cells and melatonin metabolism and showing that melatonin metabolism is altered in patients with allergic diseases. So isn't that interesting?
Amazing.
Yeah, and they also state here, notably, melatonin can orchestrate the differentiation and function of immune cells, which we were talking about. Immune cells have circadian rhythmicity, right? So many things in our body are run through the circadian. We have clock genes throughout our body. The gut microbiome is connected to the circadian rhythm, right? What isn't? So how can melatonin not influence certain things when it's connected to the circadian clock?
our bodies are interconnected organisms. If it's truly homeostatic, it should sound like, if you will, a mellifluous soliloquy, not like the junior high school band without the conductor, thud, thud, thud. That's what I tell everybody.
We need the symphony. And that's a great metaphor. I mean, especially me working at Symphony Natural Health, that was their take. How, and for a second here, if we just imagine hormones as a web, right? So in functional medicine, they're called the communicators. And I think of it as the symphony versus the cacophony, the noise versus the beautiful, the beauty in the orchestra. So when we pull on melatonin and we start tugging at it because we're low in it, we might start to change cortisol, testosterone. We could change thyroid hormone. And the reason why is because all of these hormones are circadian bound. In the morning, we wake up, we have high cortisol. This is when our cortisol should be the highest. This is when testosterone should be the highest, right? That's kind of the natural flow of things. So if we're tugging on melatonin, now we might start to see changes in cortisol, testosterone. So when people ask, Deanna, Rob, why am I low in melatonin? Well, let's also look at your cortisol. Let's look at your rhythm. And maybe your cortisol is out of whack, and that's driving your melatonin out of whack. Or maybe your melatonin is low, which is making a problem for your cortisol. So we have to look at the whole. We can't just look at one thing like melatonin in isolation. We really need to be the dot connectors, right? Do exactly what you're alluding to. We need to look at that crosstalk.
Without that melatonin, you're right about the disruption in the cortisol rhythm, but also because of that, you'll get an increase in glucose and insulin levels. Leptin goes down,
Yes.
ghrelin goes up. So now your blood sugar's up, you're hungry, you're screwed, if you will. I mean, that's my ICD-10 code, you're screwed. You got a problem.
Well, actually, you're right. There's also a glycemic impact of melatonin. It seems to have some favorable effects on glycemic response. So I think, we're learning more, Rob. We're in this for the journey. We're learning more about the receptors for melatonin. There's MT1, there's MT2. Some people have gene variants, but do we see that on a laboratory panel yet? No. We really need to see that. And I've even called out to labs and I said, we need to measure clock gene variants. If we have, the liver is the most highly oscillating organ system when it comes to clock genes. So liver, kidney, and lung are the three top ones. And I forgot if lung is second or kidney is, but I know liver for sure is number one. So we need to be thinking about liver health as it connects to melatonin, as it connects to detoxification. You and I have grown up talking about detoxification within functional medicine, right? Dr. Bland has really brought that to the forefront. Melatonin is part of the detoxification conversation because of its connection through the liver. And even my mind is going now, because if I think of traditional Chinese medicine, the clock hours, they see the organs connected to time. So the time for liver is between 1 and 3 in the morning. And when is melatonin high? That 2 to 4 a.m. So it's like, we need to focus on liver. So when people say that they're waking up in the middle of the night at 2 a.m., I often will say, you need to look at melatonin. You need to look at your detoxification, and perhaps you're toxic and you're releasing a lot and it's disruptive and waking you up, and it's getting the immune system a bit active, or even the gut. So there can be many things that are disrupting sleep. It could be inflammation in the body. As you know, people have pain. They find it difficult to sleep. So then there's pain, there's brain on fire. There could be magnesium deficiency, which can lead to less relaxation of the body. And Rob, as you know, magnesium is required for the 2-hydroxylase enzymes that take the precursor vitamin D and convert it to the active. We can't get to active vitamin D unless we have magnesium. So we need to see a triangle. It's melatonin, vitamin D, and magnesium when it comes to sleep, right? Just like I think of another triangle: cortisol, insulin, and glucose, insulin, cortisol, that web. It's kind of like the stress glucose response, similar with sleep: magnesium, vitamin D, melatonin. So think about all of them and how we're drawing upon those webs.
Wow. I mean, this has been the most action-packed 45 minutes, and I'm, as you guys know, a New York City guy who likes to talk fast. I've been knocking on my heels. This is fabulous. We've got to do this again. How can people get in touch with you if you have more questions on what you have to offer, melatonin and the product.
Sure. So first of all, the company that has Herbatonin is called Symphony Natural Health. You can find it through symphonynaturalhealth.com. Rob, I need to send you some Herbatonin if you're not already using it, so you can check it out. And then for me specifically, you can reach me at deanna.minich@symphonynaturalhealth.com.
Fabulous.
Way to get me.
It's been my pleasure. I look forward to seeing you soon. I've got the wonderful Deanna Minich. Everybody, I'm Rob Silverman. Always yours in health.
Bye-bye.